This is not a castle built to last centuries. It was built to defeat time itself. At the peak of America's greatest fortunes, one man spent what today would be hundreds of millions of dollars on a single home, not to live in it, but to make a statement. Stone by stone, ambition became architecture. But no one warned him of the cost after the lights went out. Because the larger the palace, the more merciless the upkeep. Oheka Castle wasn't destroyed by war. It wasn't lost to fire. It nearly collapsed under something far more dangerous: maintenance. And what it reveals about extreme wealth is more unsettling than ruin. In the early years of the 20th century, America was intoxicated by its own ascent. Railroads stitched the continent together with steel and ambition. Fortunes were made at speeds no previous generation had witnessed. A new class of industrialists and financiers emerged, almost overnight. Men whose wealth rivaled, and often surpassed that of Europe's old aristocracy. And with that wealth came a question that haunted every one of them. How should power look in this new American age? For many, the answer was architecture. Across the East Coast, especially on Long Island's Gold Coast, vast private estates began to rise from farmland and forest. These were not merely homes. They were declarations. Statements carved in stone that announced permanence in a country still obsessed with reinvention. In this landscape of excess and aspiration, one structure would come to stand above all others, not only in scale, but in the silent burden it carried from the moment it was completed. Its name was Oheka Castle. Unlike the ancient castles of Europe, whose names echoed centuries of lineage, Oheka was unmistakably modern. The word itself was an acronym formed from the name of its creator, Otto Hermann Kahn, a German-born banker who rose to become one of the most powerful financiers in the United States. Kahn was a senior partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a firm deeply entwined with railroads, industry, and the financial architecture of modern America. He was not born into nobility, but he understood status with surgical precision. And he understood that in America, power had to be seen to be believed. By the time Kahn began planning Oheka in 1914, he had already achieved what most men of his era could not imagine. Wealth, influence, access, all were his. Yet none of them satisfied the deeper ambition stirring beneath the surface. Kahn did not want a country house. He wanted a monument. Something that would place him, unmistakably, among the architects of a new ruling class. Oheka Castle was designed to do exactly that. The site itself was carefully chosen. Kahn selected the highest point in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, ensuring that the estate would dominate the surrounding landscape. From its elevated position, Oheka would look outward in every direction, a physical manifestation of oversight and control. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This was a seat of power, not retreat. Architecturally, Oheka drew heavily from the French Renaissance. Massive limestone walls, steep slate roofs, perfectly symmetrical facades, and long axial gardens extending outward like disciplined lines of authority. Every element was calculated to evoke European grandeur, yet executed on American scale. The estate was not content with imitation, it aimed to surpass its inspirations. Construction was monumental. Thousands of workers labored for years to bring Kahn's vision into reality. Steel framing, concrete cores, custom stonework techniques, drawn from modern engineering, were fused with old-world aesthetics. When Oheka was completed in 1919, it contained more than 120 rooms, making it the largest private residence ever built in the United States. Its cost, estimated at $11 million at the time, translated into hundreds of millions in today's currency. No private individual had ever invested so much into a single home. But Oheka was never truly a home. Its scale alone made ordinary domestic life impossible. Endless corridors, cavernous rooms, staircases that required staff simply to maintain their polish. Heating systems had to warm spaces never fully occupied. Roofs stretched across acres, demanding constant inspection and repair. Gardens required full-time crews, not seasonally, but perpetually. From the moment the last stone was set in place, Oheka became a living system, one that consumed labor, resources, and money without pause. At first, this was not a concern. Otto Khan was at the height of his power. The staff was large, the finances secure, and the era forgiving. Lavish entertaining filled the halls. Politicians, artists, industrialists, and cultural elites passed through its doors. On the surface, Oheka functioned exactly as intended, a dazzling symbol of control, refinement, and success. Yet beneath the elegance, an invisible pressure was building. Unlike financial assets that could be adjusted, downsized, or sold in pieces, Oheka was indivisible. Its maintenance costs did not scale down with use. Whether 10 guests arrived or none at all, the castle demanded the same attention. Stone eroded. Roofs leaked. Mechanical systems aged. Every year, the cost of preservation quietly increased. What had once been an expression of limitless wealth began to behave like an obligation that could not be ignored. Then history intervened. The economic optimism that had made Oheka possible would not last. Within a decade, the financial landscape of America would shift violently. Markets would collapse. Public sentiment toward extreme wealth would harden. And fortunes once considered untouchable would begin to fracture under scrutiny and strain. Oheka Castle, conceived at the absolute peak of the Gilded Age mindset, stood utterly unprepared for what came next. Its grandeur, once a triumph, would become its greatest vulnerability. The very scale that made it legendary would turn against it, transforming a masterpiece of ambition into a financial and logistical burden, unlike anything its creator had imagined. The castle had been built to endure forever. But permanence, it would soon be revealed, comes at a relentless price. Say part next to continue. When Oheka Castle was completed in 1919, it appeared finished, immaculate, commanding, complete. But in reality, that moment marked only the beginning of a second, far more demanding phase of its existence. Construction had ended. Maintenance had begun. And unlike construction, maintenance had no finish line. A castle of Oheka's scale could not be preserved by sentiment or wealth alone. It required an army. Behind the scenes, far from the glittering receptions and manicured gardens visible to guests, the daily operation of the estate functioned more like a small industrial enterprise than a private residence. Dozens of full-time staff were required simply to keep the structure standing in the condition its owner demanded. Engineers monitored heating systems large enough to serve a hotel. Electricians maintained miles of wiring threaded through thick stone walls. Plumbers battled constant pressure changes across vast vertical distances. Roofers inspected slate tiles season after season, knowing that a single failure could allow water to creep into limestone and rot the building from within. Stone, after all, does not forgive neglect. The limestone that gave Oheka its monumental appearance was both its strength and its weakness. Exposed to Long Island's harsh winters, humid summers, and constant freeze-thaw cycles, the stone required regular attention. Mortar joints eroded. Hairline cracks expanded. Water infiltration became a perpetual threat. Each repair demanded skilled labor, often specialists trained in traditional masonry techniques, already becoming rare even in the early 20th century. These were not costs that could be deferred without consequence. Delay meant damage. Damage meant exponential expense. Inside the castle, the challenges multiplied. Oheka's interior spaces were designed for spectacle, not efficiency. Ceilings soared to heights that trapped heat in winter and magnified cooling costs in summer. Rooms remained unused for months, yet still required temperature control to prevent moisture damage, warping wood, and deterioration of plaster. Fireplaces, dozens of them, had to be cleaned and inspected whether they were lit or not. Floors required constant polishing. Windows, many custom-made, needed maintenance that could not be standardized or outsourced cheaply. Even silence cost money. Outside, the estate's famous gardens presented their own relentless demands. Inspired by French formal landscapes, they were geometrically precise and utterly unforgiving of neglect. Hedges required constant trimming to maintain symmetry. Lawns had to be reseeded, irrigated, and protected. Fountains depended on complex mechanical systems vulnerable to seasonal damage. Paths cracked. Retaining walls shifted. Drainage systems clogged. Each element depended on human intervention to preserve the illusion of effortless beauty. To sustain all of this, Otto Kahn employed a permanent staff that numbered in the dozens, sometimes exceeding 100 when seasonal labor was included. Gardeners, maids, cooks, chauffeurs, maintenance workers, supervisors, each role essential, none optional. Payroll alone represented an enormous annual outlay. And unlike construction costs, which ended once paid, wages returned every week, every month, every year. At the height of Kahn's fortune, this system functioned smoothly. Money flowed. Problems were solved before they became visible. Oheka appeared timeless. But time was already working against it. The 1920s brought social change that quietly undermined estates like Oheka. Public attitudes toward extreme wealth began to shift. Progressive taxation increased. Labor costs rose. Skilled workers demanded higher wages. Meanwhile, the sheer size of the castle ensured that any improvement in efficiency was marginal at best. There was no meaningful way to optimize a structure designed without restraint. Then came the stock market crash of 1929. Though Otto Kahn did not lose everything overnight, the crash shattered the illusion of financial invulnerability that had defined the Gilded Age. Investment income declined. Liquidity tightened. And the cost of maintaining Oheka unchanged, unyielding, began to weigh heavily even on a man of Kahn's stature. What had once been a manageable expression of success now behaved like a fixed liability. Indifferent to economic reality, nor damaging still was the shift in cultural mood. The very extravagance that Oheka embodied became unfashionable, even resented. Lavish entertaining declined. Large staffs were reduced. Rooms went dark. Portions of the castle fell into partial disuse, accelerating decay rather than slowing it. A building designed to be alive with activity began to stagnate, and stagnation, for a structure of stone and steel, is corrosive. Otto Kahn died in 1934. With his death, Oheka lost not just its owner, but its purpose. The man whose identity had justified the castle's existence was gone, and what remained was an object too large, too expensive, and too inflexible for a changing world. Without the singular force of Kahn's wealth and will, the maintenance machine faltered. Deferred repairs accumulated. Staff numbers shrank. Systems aged without replacement. The castle did not collapse dramatically. It did something far more unsettling. It began to quietly fail. Oheka had been built as a triumph of excess, but excess proved unsustainable without constant reinforcement. What was once a symbol of permanence now revealed itself as profoundly fragile, dependent not on stone, but on uninterrupted streams of money and labor. And once those streams weakened, the castle's future narrowed rapidly. The question was no longer whether Oheka could be maintained at its original standard. The question was whether it could survive at all. Say part next to continue. After Otto Hermann Kahn's death in 1934, Oheka Castle entered a phase that would define much of its 20th century existence. Not as a symbol of triumph, but as a problem no one quite knew how to solve. The castle had been conceived as a personal statement, an extension of one man's identity and power. Without him, the logic of its existence collapsed. What remained was an object of astonishing scale, burdened with costs that no longer made cultural or economic sense. The heirs who inherited Oheka did not inherit Kahn's appetite for spectacle, nor his tolerance for expense. The United States was no longer a nation impressed by private palaces. The Great Depression had reshaped values, and public opinion increasingly viewed extreme displays of wealth as symbols of moral failure rather than success. In that climate, Oheka became less an asset than an embarrassment too large to live in comfortably, too costly to maintain properly, and too idiosyncratic to sell easily. Attempts were made to find new uses for the property. Like many great estates of the Gilded Age, Oheka was briefly reimagined as an institutional space rather than a private residence. Portions of the grounds were subdivided. The castle itself was sold and resold, passing through the hands of owners who viewed it less as a home and more as an opportunity or a burden to be endured temporarily. Each transition stripped away another layer of coherence, another piece of the system that had once kept the estate alive. During the mid-20th century, Oheka served as a retreat for sanitation workers from New York City. On paper, this new function offered salvation, steady occupancy, institutional funding, and a rationale for continued maintenance. In practice, the mismatch between purpose and structure accelerated the castle's decline. The building had been designed for ceremonial living, not mass accommodation. Modifications were crude. Elegant rooms were partitioned. Original fixtures were removed or covered. Maintenance focused on functionality rather than preservation, sacrificing long-term integrity for short-term utility. Over time, even this arrangement proved unsustainable. As costs mounted and funding priorities shifted, Oheka fell into neglect. Systems failed without replacement. Roofs leaked. Water damage spread unchecked through walls and ceilings. Decorative elements were stripped for scrap or destroyed through indifference. Windows shattered. Doors were left unsecured. What had once been guarded by staff and status became vulnerable to trespass, vandalism, and theft. By the 1970s, Oheka Castle stood largely abandoned. Nature began to reclaim what ambition had built. Ivy crept across stone walls. Weeds pushed through cracked terraces. Interior spaces grew damp and unstable. Mold bloomed where heat no longer circulated. Entire sections of the castle became unsafe to enter. The gardens, once meticulously ordered, dissolved into tangled growth, their geometric precision erased by time and neglect. Yet abandonment did not bring peace. Because Oheka was too large to disappear quietly, its decay became public. Urban explorers, vandals, and curiosity seekers moved in. Fires were set. Artifacts vanished. Graffiti scarred limestone. Each intrusion compounded the damage, pushing the structure closer to irreversible loss. Preservationists warned that without immediate intervention, Oheka would soon cross a threshold beyond which restoration would be impossible. The tragedy of Oheka was not sudden destruction, but prolonged indifference. Unlike ruins romanticized by centuries, Oheka decayed within living memory. People could still remember its grandeur. That proximity made its decline more unsettling. It was a reminder that wealth, no matter how extreme, could not guarantee permanence. A building designed to outlast generations was unraveling in less than one lifetime. By the late 20th century, Oheka stood at a crossroads familiar to many great estates of its era. Demolition loomed as a practical solution. The land alone was valuable. The structure itself was a liability, a shell demanding millions merely to stabilize, let alone restore. For developers, the numbers rarely justified sentiment. What saved Oheka was not inevitability, but choice. In the early 1980s, developer Gary Melius purchased the property with a vision that many considered unrealistic. He did not see Oheka as a relic to be erased, but as a narrative unfinished. Restoration would require extraordinary investment, historical sensitivity, and patience. The castle had to be reinvented, not as a private fantasy, but as a public experience capable of generating the revenue necessary to sustain itself. The gamble was enormous. Years of painstaking restoration followed. Stone by stone, system by system, Oheka was brought back from the edge of oblivion. But the restoration itself revealed the final irony. Saving the castle cost nearly as much, in relative terms, as building it had decades earlier. The maintenance nightmare had not ended. It had merely evolved. Oheka survived but only by abandoning the illusion that it could ever again exist as a private home. It had taken collapse, neglect, and near destruction to make that truth undeniable. Say part next to continue. When Gary Melius acquired Oheka Castle in the early 1980s, he did not inherit a masterpiece. He inherited a ruin that still carried the memory of greatness in its bones. The limestone walls stood, but much of what had once made the castle functional, elegant, and coherent was gone. Roofs leaked. Mechanical systems were obsolete or destroyed. Interiors bore the scars of decades of misuse and neglect. What remained was not a romantic relic, but a structure balanced precariously between survival and collapse. Restoring Oheka was never a matter of taste alone. It was an economic problem of staggering proportions. Unlike new construction, restoration offers no clean slate. Every decision is constrained by what already exists. Stone cannot simply be replaced without matching original quarry sources. Decorative elements must be recreated by hand when originals are lost. Modern building codes must be integrated invisibly into a century-old structure, never designed to accommodate them. Fire suppression, climate control, electrical systems, and accessibility requirements all had to be installed without destroying the historic fabric that justified the castle's preservation in the first place. Each solution created new costs. Restoration stretched over years, consuming tens of millions of dollars. Skilled artisans were brought in to repair masonry, recreate plasterwork, and restore wood detailing. Roofs were rebuilt, windows replicated, gardens reconstructed from archival plans. Nothing about the process was efficient. Every step revealed another hidden failure, another layer of decay that demanded attention before progress could continue. Yet even as Oheka was resurrected, a crucial reality became clear. Restoration did not eliminate the maintenance nightmare. It institutionalized it. Once reopened as a hotel, event venue, and cultural site, Oheka finally achieved something it had never possessed as a private residence, a functional economic purpose. Revenue replaced personal wealth as the engine of survival. Weddings, conferences, tourism, and film productions brought life back into the halls. The castle no longer existed solely to be admired. It had to perform. But performance came with conditions. Operating a historic estate at this scale requires constant reinvestment. Heating and cooling systems run continuously to protect interiors from moisture damage. Landscaping crews work year-round to maintain formal gardens that cannot be allowed to drift into neglect. Insurance costs reflect the irreplaceable nature of the structure. Preservation standards limit cost-cutting options. Every repair must balance modern necessity with historical integrity. In this way, Oheka's modern life mirrors its original contradiction. The castle generates income precisely because of its grandeur. Yet that same grandeur ensures that operating margins remain narrow. There is no inexpensive way to maintain a building conceived without restraint. Every guest, every event, every photograph taken on the grounds contributes to the illusion of effortless luxury, an illusion sustained only through constant labor and expenditure. What Oheka demonstrates, more clearly than almost any surviving Gilded Age estate, is that extreme wealth does not disappear when the money runs out. It lingers in physical form, demanding payment long after the era that created it has passed. The castle outlived its original owner, outlasted the social values that justified its creation, and survived economic systems that once made it possible. But survival required transformation. Oheka could not remain what Otto Khan had intended. It could only endure by becoming something else. A shared experience rather than a private statement. A business rather than a personal monument. Even then, its future remains conditional. Preservation is never permanent. It is a process renewed every year, every budget cycle, every decision to repair rather than abandon. In this sense, Oheka Castle is not simply a story about architecture or wealth. It is a warning embedded in stone. A reminder that ambition scaled beyond human limits creates obligations that persist far longer than the fortunes that built them. What begins as freedom can harden into responsibility. What begins as triumph can become endurance. The maintenance nightmare never truly ends. It only changes hands. Say part next to continue. Oheka Castle's struggle was not an anomaly. It was part of a broader American pattern that unfolded quietly across the 20th century. As dozens of vast private estates built during the Gilded Age confronted the same inescapable truth, scale, once celebrated as triumph, became the very force that undermined their survival. Oheka simply endured long enough, and visibly enough, to make that truth undeniable. At the turn of the century, America's ultra-wealthy believed they were building for eternity. Inspired by European palaces, they constructed estates that assumed uninterrupted prosperity, stable labor markets, and a social order that would continue to legitimize extreme private luxury. These assumptions were rarely questioned. In an era defined by rapid industrial expansion, wealth seemed self-renewing, and the costs of maintaining grandeur appeared trivial when measured against seemingly endless income. But history did not cooperate. Across Long Island, the Hudson Valley, Newport, and beyond, massive residences began to encounter the same pressures that haunted Oheka. Labor costs rose as domestic service declined as a lifelong profession. Taxes increased as governments sought revenue and accountability from concentrated wealth. Social values shifted, turning ostentatious private palaces into symbols of excess rather than aspiration. Buildings designed for armies of servants suddenly found themselves short of hands willing or able to maintain them. The architecture itself resisted adaptation. Grand staircases, ceremonial halls, and sprawling wings did not translate easily into modern domestic life. Heating inefficiencies, outdated plumbing, and rigid layouts made even partial occupation costly. Attempts to downsize use only accelerated deterioration. Empty rooms decayed faster than lived-in ones, creating a paradox in which neglect was both a symptom and a cause of decline. Some estates met abrupt ends. Others entered long periods of limbo. In Newport, many mansions survived only by opening their doors to the public, transforming private excess into shared heritage. In the Hudson Valley, estates were absorbed into state park systems or converted into institutional uses. On Long Island, entire properties were subdivided, their main houses demolished, while land was carved into residential developments. The castles vanished not in dramatic collapses, but through practical decisions, driven by economics rather than memory. Oheka's survival places it among a shrinking minority. What distinguishes Oheka is not that it escaped the maintenance nightmare, but that it confronted it directly. Its scale demanded either demolition or reinvention. There was no middle ground. The castle could not be quietly reduced or simplified. It had to justify its existence anew, generation after generation, in a society that no longer produced private monuments of that magnitude. This broader pattern reveals a deeper miscalculation shared by the builders of the Gilded Age. They assumed that wealth, once accumulated, could be frozen in architecture. That money could be transformed into stone and thereby rendered permanent. What they underestimated was time, and the way time converts luxury into liability. Buildings, unlike financial assets, do not adapt easily. They age. They resist efficiency. They demand care long after their original purpose has faded. The larger and more elaborate the structure, the more relentless that demand becomes. In this way, the estates of the Gilded Age became instruments that carried the future cost of past ambition forward, imposing it on heirs, institutions, and eventually the public. Oheka Castle stands today, not as a solitary cautionary tale, but as a representative one. Its preservation allows us to see, in physical form, the consequences of an era that equated size with permanence and wealth with immunity. The castle endures because it was transformed into something society could support. Many others were not so fortunate. And yet, even in survival, the lesson remains intact. Grandeur is not self-sustaining. Monuments do not preserve themselves. And wealth, when converted into architecture at extreme scale, becomes a responsibility that outlives the dream that created it. Oheka's story is America's story in miniature, a cycle of ambition, excess, reckoning, and reinvention, written not in ledgers, but in limestone. Say part next to continue. To understand why Oheka Castle was built at all, one must look beyond balance sheets and blueprints, and into the quieter territory of human ambition. Otto Hermann Kahn did not build Oheka simply because he could afford to. He built it because wealth, at a certain magnitude, begins to lose its ability to reassure. Money can buy comfort, influence, and security, but it cannot easily answer the deeper questions that arise when material needs are long surpassed. What remains is the desire to be seen, remembered, and anchored in history. Architecture offered Kahn a solution. Unlike investments that fluctuate or reputations that fade, a castle promised permanence. Stone seemed immune to market cycles. Size suggested endurance. The act of building itself carried symbolic weight, implying confidence not just in one's fortune, but in one's place within the future. Oheka was conceived as proof that its creator belonged among the great figures of his time, and that his success was not temporary or accidental. Yet, permanence is an illusion architecture cannot fully sustain. Buildings preserve form, but not context. the world that gave meaning to Oheka, the Gilded Age belief in limitless growth, the social acceptance of private extravagance, the labor systems that made constant service possible, did not survive. When those conditions disappeared, the castle remained, stranded in a new moral and economic landscape that could not easily accommodate it. This disjunction lies at the heart of Oheka's maintenance nightmare. The structure continued to demand resources, as if the old world still existed. But the justification for providing those resources had vanished. What had once felt like a rational extension of success began to resemble an unreasonable obligation. For heirs and later owners, the castle was no longer a dream fulfilled, but a problem inherited, one that could not be ignored without consequences. Psychologically, this transformation is profound. The builders of extreme private estates rarely imagined themselves as burdening the future. They believed they were gifting it beauty, culture, and refinement. But scale alters intention. When architecture exceeds human need by orders of magnitude, it ceases to be a gift and becomes a demand. Each generation that inherits such a structure must decide whether to sacrifice resources to preserve a vision they did not choose, or to let it disappear and be judged for the loss. Oheka forced that decision repeatedly. Its survival required an ongoing negotiation between reverence for the past and responsibility to the present. Preservation was not framed as nostalgia, but as adaptation. The castle had to justify itself continuously, not as a relic of wealth, but as a site of shared value. In doing so, it revealed a truth, often obscured by grandeur. Legacy is not created by size alone, but by usefulness across time. This is where Oheka diverges from many of its peers. It did not survive because it was admired. It survived because it was made necessary. Yet even necessity does not erase the psychological tension embedded in the structure. Visitors experience awe, but also a subtle discomfort. The scale impresses, but it also overwhelms. The question lingers unspoken: why was this much ever needed? That question is not an accusation. It is an invitation to reflect on the limits of ambition when it seeks expression through permanence. Oheka Castle stands as a monument not just to wealth, but to the human desire to outrun time. It reveals how that desire, when translated into stone, produces consequences that cannot be contained within a single lifetime. Maintenance becomes the physical manifestation of legacy, the price paid by the present for the dreams of the past. In this sense, Oheka's story is less about failure than about clarity. It shows that ambition does not end when a building is completed. It continues, silently, in every decision to repair, restore, and sustain. The maintenance nightmare is not a flaw in the castle. It is the logical outcome of building beyond the scale of human life. Say part next to continue. Today, Oheka Castle stands restored, illuminated, and alive in ways that would have been difficult to imagine during its decades of abandonment. The limestone walls, once scarred by neglect and exposure, now catch the light with renewed clarity. Gardens that had dissolved into wilderness again follow deliberate lines and measured symmetry. Inside, climate-controlled halls host guests, celebrations, and quiet moments of admiration. By most visible measures, the castle has been saved. Yet preservation is not the same as resolution. Oheka does not exist in a state of completion. It exists in a state of vigilance. Every season introduces new vulnerabilities. Winter freezes test stone and mortar. Summer humidity threatens interiors. Mechanical systems age, no matter how carefully maintained. The castle survives not because it has defeated time, but because time is constantly managed, negotiated, and paid for. This is the condition of all monumental ambition, once it outlives its creator. Otto Hermann Kahn built Oheka to project certainty of wealth, of status, of belonging among the architects of a new American elite. But certainty proved to be the most fragile element of all. The world that validated such a structure dissolved within a generation. Economic systems shifted. Social values hardened against excess. Labor structures collapsed. What remained was the building itself, stripped of the assumptions that had once made it rational. Oheka's endurance required a fundamental transformation of meaning. It could no longer exist as a private declaration. It had to become a shared space, justified not by ownership, but by participation. Weddings, cultural events, hospitality, and tourism did more than generate revenue, they reframed the castle's purpose. The building survived by allowing others inside its story. In doing so, it surrendered the exclusivity that once defined it. But even this transformation carries tension. To walk through Oheka today is to experience both awe and unease. The scale impresses, but it also overwhelms. The symmetry calms, yet the excess lingers. Visitors sense, often without articulating it, that this structure was built beyond human necessity. That realization does not diminish the beauty of the castle. It deepens it, adding a layer of introspection that pure admiration cannot provide. The maintenance nightmare, so often discussed in financial terms, ultimately reveals itself as a moral question. Every dollar spent preserving Oheka represents a choice to honor history rather than erase it, to accept responsibility rather than deny it. Preservation is never neutral. It requires deciding which parts of the past deserve to occupy space in the present. Oheka remains because enough people, across decades, decided that its story was worth carrying forward, despite the cost. And the cost never disappears. Oheka stands as evidence that extreme wealth does not vanish when fortunes fade. It solidifies. It becomes physical. It demands care from those who did not create it, and never consented to its scale. In this way, the castle is less a relic of luxury than a case study in legacy. How ambition extends its reach far beyond intention. What Oheka ultimately teaches is not that grand dreams are foolish, but that they are incomplete without foresight. Building for eternity without planning for adaptation turns vision into burden. The castle survived only when it accepted change, when permanence gave way to flexibility, and when private ambition yielded to public stewardship. Even now, its future is not guaranteed. Preservation is a living agreement, renewed each year through investment, labor, and belief. Oheka will endure only as long as society continues to find meaning in maintaining it. This fragility is not a weakness. It is honesty. It acknowledges that nothing built by humans escapes context, and nothing grand remains relevant without effort. Oheka Castle still stands, not as proof that wealth conquers time, but as proof that time reveals the true cost of wealth. Its walls no longer proclaim dominance. They ask a question. How much are we willing to carry forward, and what must we change to ensure that what endures does not become a burden once again?